Hello everybody, good afternoon. I'm not even going to try to teach you how to pronounce my name, but everyone just calls me Vili. So as mentioned, I'm an economic sociologist with a background in computer science as well. Before coming to OII, I worked at LSE and University of Tokyo as a postdoc, but I'm originally from Finland. And I also worked as a game developer briefly before embarking on my career in the social sciences. So broadly speaking, my research is about economic phenomena on the internet. And as a sociologist, I'm particularly interested in their social underpinnings and also their social implications. And I've titled this talk, Emerging Markets and the Internet. And usually, of course, when we say emerging markets, we mean emerging market countries, countries where the economy is rapidly growing. But if we take that term literally, we can also think of it as emerging markets for goods and services that didn't used to exist before, for example, on the internet. And in this talk and in my research, I address both, and especially intersections of these two meanings in different places on the internet. So first, let me talk about goods and services or markets that didn't used to exist, markets for goods and services that didn't used to exist and that emerged online. So the pervasive adoption of the internet in the rich countries has led to emergence for markets for things like virtual currencies. Bitcoin has been in the news a lot lately. For virtual goods in online games and mobile games. And even for things like Facebook likes and Twitter followers, so markets where you can buy these things for real money. One Twitter follower costs about 10p, or if you want an organic version as opposed to a synthetic one produced by an algorithm, then you have to pay about 20p. So we can refer to all these different kinds of virtual assets in the markets where they're traded collectively as virtual economies. And in my research, in my past research, I've documented the rise and emergence of these markets. But being a sociologist, I've more importantly analyzed their social underpinnings. Questions like, what makes a person so attracted to a virtual item as to be ready to pay real money for it? Or what attributes does a virtual currency need to have to win adoption? And so my findings are summarized in this book that's now finally come out. The manuscript was written already over a year ago, well, almost 2 years ago now. But it's now coming out from MIT Press in the spring, and I'm very happy about that. And the end users of this knowledge are game companies and publishers of other consumer online services, but also regulators and policymakers, I think, who are struggling to understand these new kinds of markets and how they are influencing people's behavior online. So this also relates to the debate on online games and whether it's good for people to play so much games or not, but from an economic perspective. So that was emerging markets in the sense of new markets that didn't exist before. And now let's talk about emerging markets in the sense of countries. So, as I mentioned, many gamers are ready to pay real money for virtual goods inside games, and where there's demand, supply tends to emerge. And so, almost 10 years ago already, a cottage industry of professional online gamers emerged in China and some other parts of the world to cater to this market. And so these are essentially player for hire services providers, or people who play online games for a living. The World Bank's InfoDev program, which is tasked with basically understanding how ICTs could be used to help economic development and employment around the world, got interested in this. And so they asked me to do a study on the development potential of this kind of game labor. And that was published in 2011. And so the conclusion was that while this is a real market, and in 2009 it employed as many as 100,000 full-time equivalents in countries like China and Vietnam, it doesn't really scale. It turns out there's a limited need for basically online gaming services in the world. Also, it's not a very sustainable market, because now what's happened already is that game companies have reinvented their revenue models and are now selling the virtual goods to you directly. So you no longer need to go to a Chinese service provider to obtain those. But it was an example of an emerging market on the internet, an emerging market for game assets, intersecting with an emerging market country to give rise to an interesting socio-economic impact. And so this example leads to my current research, which deals with online labor more generally, things like crowdsourcing, e-lancing, and online task markets. So in the same way as you can buy computing power today and server space from a cloud computing provider, you can now buy commodified human labor over the internet. So there are dozens of marketplaces where you as an employer can go and buy anything from simple photo tagging and data processing tasks to language translation, graphic design, and even simple programming work. So the difference to traditional business process outsourcing is that you're outsourcing directly to individuals working from their homes or cyber cafes rather than to a company. So this form of work is growing rapidly. For example, the amount of work conducted through one e-lancing platform called Odesk grew from 2 million hours in the first quarter of 2010 to over 10 million hours worked in the first quarter of this year. And most of this work, at least on this particular platform, is conducted in developing and emerging market countries. So naturally, this gives rise to all kinds of questions, and several management scholars have already written about the implications of cloud labor for business. Many development practitioners, like different branches of the World Bank, are very excited about the potential development impact of this kind of cloud labor and work. But so far, there is a lack of research on the implications of this form of work for the actual workers. What does it mean to be a professional cloud worker? What kind of implications does it have for everyday life and society? So I'm going to sort of wrap up by giving you a very brief overview of the initial results of a sort of multi-year research agenda looking into this question. And these are results from a qualitative study that is based on a number of deep interviews with workers as well as managers who manage such workers. So the data consists of over 50 hours of qualitative online interviews, and also also of the managers. And also we participated as cloud workers in these sites ourselves, and acted as employers on these sites as well, and so used this basically participant observation to triangulate our findings. And in this brief presentation, I'm just going to highlight two types of findings that particularly stood out from the data. And the first is identity. So in modern society, we obviously identify quite strongly to ourselves, but also to others through our occupation, where we work, what we do, and so on. But what if our employers and our jobs were constantly changing, even several times a day, as they do if you are a cloud worker, a sort of extreme type of freelancer? And so we found that our informants suffered a sort of identity stress, because they could not form a stable self-identity around their work, and they could not communicate that also to their friends and families, to their loved ones. Partly to solve this, partly what they did is that they developed various coping mechanisms, such as either evading the whole issue of identity or pretending to be online gaming instead of actually working. So in some contexts, like United States, it might be more sort of respectable to tell people, what were you doing on the computer? Well, I'm playing games, instead of telling them, well, I'm doing a form of low status online work. So work is less respected than gaming is. Another type, and this is my last slide, another result that stood out was the question of self-control. So in a normal sort of organizational setting, you have a lot of these behavioral controls imposed upon you, but as a freelancer, especially this kind of an extreme type of online freelancer with no social or physical context for work, you're left to regulate yourself entirely on your own. So we found that this actually created challenges to the workers. So people saying things like, I find myself working far longer than I intended, about 95% of the time. I'm starting to think it's a problem. Or I feel bad when I take a long shower or take too much time to eat. The work/life line is definitely blurry. So to cope with these problems, new types of problems of self-control, people again turned back to the internet. So they found internet communities and online communities to replace some of the social context that normally would be provided by a physical workplace. And another thing that they did was that they used all kinds of software tools, browser plugins, mobile applications, web applications, to actually build a structure of control around themselves and structure their lives. So kinds of alarms that will tell them when a certain type of work is available, or software that will track their earnings and basically give them feedback based on whether they've earned enough today or not. And so as a sort of conclusion, you could say that they've escaped the iron cage of bureaucracy, but they've ended up building this sort of a new digital cage of self-control around themselves. So that pretty much concludes my presentation. In summary, my research is about economic phenomena in online environments, particularly their social underpinnings, but also their socio-economic implications around the world. Thank you very much.
Did you do any research into how these e-workers view their responsibilities in terms of confidentiality and data privacy and all that?
That's a big question in the industry, yes. So usually most people, the way they're trying to solve this now, these providers of this kind of cloud labor services, is that they algorithmically break up the work into small pieces, as you perhaps know, so as to not reveal anything confidential to any individual worker. But then the question of, could we actually trust a worker somewhere, an anonymous worker somewhere across the internet with an actual confidential piece of data? I think when the relationship is framed in this kind of an extremely market-based transient fashion, that your duty to the employer persists only as long as it takes to complete that task, which is usually from seconds to minutes, then no, you probably can't trust them to, you know, keep your data confidential afterwards. But then some of these providers are finding ways to try to sort of evoke a sense of social identity, giving these workers titles and sort of assigning them into virtual teams, even though they're still sort of administratively speaking contractors. There's no employment relationship. And in this kind of a case, because of in-group, I guess both social psychologists would say that sort of in-group behaviors kick in, and you sort of, out of solidarity for your team, you might keep confidential things confidential. So there are techniques to do that, perhaps.
Can I ask, your table showed micro-work incomes.
Yes.
I mean, what it doesn't show is sort of number of hours worked to get that income, and also, I mean, do people regulate themselves by targets for income or targets for hours work, or both?
Typically, targets for income is what we've found, and so in this study we had 3 different kinds of samples. The people working in the United States, they were typically juggling several jobs, and part of their income came from online work. Some of them were homemakers, so they didn't depend entirely on their online income. but so they did have certain earnings targets that they needed to fulfill, and some days they would reach those targets faster, some days it would take longer to reach them.
And typically, how many hours a week would they be working for those incomes?
Well, for this kind of, well, let's say the typical income for the very sort of low-level work is something from around $2–3 per hour. So they would really have to work, and they would really work, from morning until midnight. And even when they weren't working, they were still in front of the computer looking for well-paying tasks, or chatting with other workers or something like this. A slightly more high, so this study was done in a very sort of low skill platform. Then if you go up, you go to virtual assistant jobs, graphic design, programming jobs. You start from $10 per hour all the way up to 20.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, have you looked at the other end of the transactions, so the people who are procuring these services, and
yes,
what motivates them and so on? Was that part of your...
Well, that's not what I specialize in. So there are scholars in the University of Texas, a few in Stanford, who are more, so they tend to be management scholars who are interested in how are firms actually using this and what are the motivations, and I draw on that. And I contribute back to that because they, even though they are mostly interested in how can we use this workforce, whereas my primary interest in what does this mean for the future of work and society, my work does contribute back to the management literature as well, because it reveals things about, well, how can we treat these workers better so that they will, for example, maintain confidentiality and so on. Yes,
I guess my question's related, which is, what do you think the implications are to the traditional theory of the firm? What is a firm?
Well, I think in organization studies right now, that this whole idea of a firm and the sort of transaction cost analysis way of defining firm versus market, that model is kind of breaking down. And of course, Manuel Castells has sort of predicted that we're moving into this more networked economy of individual players sort of dynamically networking and forming this kind of structures. And to some extent, yes, this is an example of that. But to some extent, the sort of, especially the core of big businesses, it tends to remain. I mean, Manuel Castells' predictions have not completely been sort of borne out by what has happened. So I think we're in a sort of hybrid state where, yes, companies will remain and exist, but at the same time, employment, there will be a bigger and bigger contingent workforce consisting of this kind of online workers, but also of consumers, because firms, that's another part of my research that I didn't talk about, but how firms, through things like gamification, are now bringing consumers into production processes. And in that way, the distinction between a sort of freelance worker and a consumer who might be paid in virtual currency or in whatever way becomes increasingly blurred. Time for one more question, I think.
I do have another.
Yes, please.
Which is, did you look at the upper? These tasks look like rote tasks.
Yes, they are.
Did you examine the far end of creative tasks that are also being outsourced?
Well, two answers to that. One is that we haven't sort of gotten into that yet. Mm-hmm. So I'm currently talking with an economist at New York Stern School of Business who's worked as a staff economist at one of the platforms that provides this higher end work, and so possibly doing a study with him. But the other answer to that question is that I don't really need to do that, because this kind of very high-end outsourcing of highly skilled professionals is something that scholars of work and organization have been studying for quite a while already. What's more new, I think, is this kind of cloud labor, really the sort of menial jobs that are being outsourced now in this way, and that's a niche that we're currently targeting. All right. Thanks very much.